On the banks of the Tennessee River, only a few miles upstream of Knoxville, there is a land that was set aside by a family 100 years ago. A mere 20 acres of rolling riverside land, complete with a sinkhole. At first glance, it is beautiful, but not different from other such reaches along the river. But it was used, even as the family owned it, to serve a loftier purpose than human occupation. It was to be a sanctuary. The property was in sight of a growing city that was sure to swallow it in the coming years. However, that didn't happen. It has remained as it was 100 years ago when the family bought it, secluded and surrounded in the middle of a developing city. And what is even more unusual, the land did not pass down through the family. They owned it but for one generation. But in that period of time, the family's distinctive lives, their enthusiasm and inventiveness, their passion and personal heartbreak, so marked this place that today it's simply known by their name, Imes. Hi, I'm Bill Landry, and this is the Heartland Series. When H.P. and Alice Imes bought this land in 1910, they had distinctive ideas on how they would use it. And perhaps more importantly, even then, they had plans to share it. On this program, our cameras will explore the trails and sites of the original property. You'll spend time in the cover of Imes Nature Center woods and enjoy the bird life they so passionately protected, and walk the informal gardens they left behind. Today, the original 20 acres has grown into 275 acres and contains a landscape unlike anything, anywhere in a city. The story of Imes, above all, is the story of a family. In the mere 50 years they lived here, they created a touching legacy. As it did in their day, the defining moments of the Imes family life will interweave with the natural life that surrounded them. Join us as we tell the story of their place by the river.
I can't think of a better place for our kids to grow up.
No, it's beautiful here.
A Place by the River, the Imes Family Legacy, a Heartland Series special, presented in high definition. Brought to you by Home Federal Bank and GMC Terrain.
In the early 1900s, the American people began to consider a sobering fact. There was no longer a frontier, no new land opening up for settlement. The land that once defined their very lives was becoming less and less important to making a living. The majority of people still lived in rural situations, but it was clear that was changing. People were moving from farms to the cities for jobs. As the cities became crowded, what happened there was considered vulgar and crude. In Knoxville, hundreds of young children filled jobs in the cotton mills. This city way of life seemed the antithesis of the rural ideal. The reaction to this sudden cultural change led to several reform movements. The notion that land should be preserved or set aside for public use was one of those movements. It was a new idea with considerable opposition. Many political battles would be fought over the concept of public lands. Naturalism also began to have a presence in the culture. As people realized that both land and animal life were finite, that is, it wasn't limitless, there was a real effort to study life in a scientific manner and to preserve it for future generations. Conservation entered into the dialogue of a population that had never considered it before. This is the world that H.P. Imes and Alice Yoe lived in. Both were well educated for the time and from successful and respected families. H.P. attended the University of Tennessee and then an art school in Ohio. He became a commercial artist upon his return to Knoxville. Alice Yo was born in Jefferson City, Tennessee, the daughter of a Civil War Confederate veteran. Her father was an attorney and later mayor of West Knoxville. H.P. and Alice were married in 1908. They embraced the new sensibility about preservation. Their honeymoon was spent hiking in the Smoky Mountains, not for a day, but for a week. There were very few man-made trails in the mountains in those days. To get somewhere mainly required determination and a compass.
Don't make the same mistake I did, dear. Here, let me help you. I'll catch you.
A marriage that survived such a start was bound to have potential. They celebrated an early anniversary with a canoe trip to Chattanooga from Knoxville. By the end of the trip, H.P. had lost his shoes, and Alice's fine dress was waterlogged, but they loved every minute of it. Their start of a family came fairly late in life. Their first child, Elizabeth, called Izzy, was born in 1909. H.P. was 32, Alice 28. Shortly after Izzy's birth, they went looking for land closer to town.
This land has got so much promise.
They settled on 20 acres in South Knoxville along the Tennessee River. It was just a mile or so from the streetcar line, yet seemed remote.
20 acres.
There were small farms bordering and 2 large quarries nearby. On the surface, it didn't look like the start of a sanctuary. Over the next 10 years, 3 more daughters would be born. Along with Elizabeth, there was now Josephine, athletic and precocious. Mary, outgoing and a born naturalist, and finally the baby, Martha. The place by the river began to take shape in the 1920s. Their house was simple and rustic. Most thought it looked like it had grown out of the soil. Alice took time to write down her thoughts as their great experiment grew.
I devote the major portion of my time to gardening, my prime interest being growing flowers, with vegetables secondary. The land slopes gently towards the river and lies fairly flat and smooth in front of the house. Although we never considered giving our modest little place a name, my choice would have been Long Shadows.
Living outdoors, the naturalist life was to be the life of the Imes family. The girls didn't have bedrooms as much as they had a screened sleeping porch, open to the elements on 3 sides, all year long.
Having always been outdoor people, we devoted little time to planning the simple little house we occupy. Our plan consists of screened porches on both floors and a dining alcove facing the garden and overlooking the lily ponds, fruit trees, and 3 terraced rock walls.
Cousin Patsy Pittenger and Susan Polk, both now in their 90s, remember it fondly.
They were the kind of people where we like to go and spend the night. Sometimes we were on the sleeping porch, and if the weather was nice, we'd just take our blankets out in the yard and sleep out.
They had a tent, a good-sized tent that we would sometimes pitch out in the yard, but we didn't always even sleep in the tent.
It was very isolated at that time. I mean, it seemed to us like it was.
Oh, yes.
Soon Alice's gardens matured, and there were bird boxes scattered all over the 20 acres. Josephine kept an Imes family notebook for a time.
When Alice was ready to make the garden, HP took days to decide which trees to cut. The good ones he didn't want to sacrifice, the bad ones he couldn't bear to cut because the owls and peckerwoods would miss them so.
The place was getting a reputation for attracting people. Interesting and influential people involved in starting the Great Smoky Mountains National Park stopped by. Carlos Campbell was an influential force in forming the park. His son Jim relished every visit to Imes.
Oh, I loved it. It was a fun place to come to, poke around. And I wasn't as interested in birds as I was snakes and animals, and I'd always be looking for snakes. Never found any, but looking for all kinds of critters, and I left to go down to the river.
While the Imes did not belong to the Smoky Mountain Hiking Club, they supported the effort to make the mountains into a national park. On a birding trip to Mount LeConte, HP encouraged the establishment of the first permanent camp there by his friend Paul Adams. This photo documents the Imes family at the first use of the camp. When the girls were old enough, the entire family would make the hike up Mount LeConte. And befitting the style of the time, they looked good doing it. HP created artwork, both posters and stamps, to promote the idea of the new national park. As more and more people discovered the sanctuary, HP and Alice had to adjust to the growing number of visitors. By personal nature, that was easier for Alice than HP. Paul James, the director of the Imes Nature Center, has just completed a book on the Imes family.
They really were chalk and cheese, the fact that they were so different in their way of life, in a way, in terms of the things that they enjoyed, in terms of social interactions, and yet they were both alike in terms of their passions for the outdoors and native plants and horticulture and ornithology. HP apparently could not abide to go to a party. He would go out and hide in the woods rather than attend a party, whereas Alice was very much comfortable with that kind of scene.
In the 1920s, Alice was one of the guiding forces in the establishment of Girl Scouts in Knoxville. In 1925, she and her sister-in-law, Mabel Townsend, were largely responsible for the creation of the first Girl Scout camp in the Smokies. Named Camp Margaret Townsend, it stood where Tremont is today. All the Imes daughters became active in Girl Scouts. And as you would expect, all excelled at it. Mary, in particular, showed great aptitude and understanding of all the outdoor skills. When we return, the Roaring Twenties continued to keep the pace at the Imes home hopping. The daughters of Alice and H.P. Imes were presented with an extraordinary life for the time. All of them relished the peace of a rural setting, but true rural children lacked advantages the Imes daughters enjoyed. The Imes girls had access to the good schools and modern conveniences a city could offer. Yet they could escape the coal smoke sky, congestion and stench of downtown Knoxville whenever they returned home. Alice and H.P. doted over the girls in every way possible.
They embraced the natural world and embraced life. I mean, obviously, the four daughters were the center of their world when they were young, and just, the coming and going of people. When the house was well established and the garden was established, and it must have really been a place to be.
Ah, so you found a little friend there.
Yeah, I found a ladybug on the flowers.
Oh. Yeah, Alice, I was thinking, I think it'd be nice if maybe we put a pond right here in this area.
Well, that would be lovely.
I think the girls would like it a lot. Oh, the Tennessee River's nice to swim in, but what with the current, Could be a
Yes.
little dangerous. It'd be nice to have more of a controlled environment, don't you think?
I think the girls would love that.
I think so. What do you think, little ladybug?
The Lotus Pond soon became a reality, but HP's thoughts of keeping the girls safe went unheeded. They were going to swim where they wanted to.
When we go out to their house, they would, take us swimming down in the river, in the sluice, and we'd take a picnic and stay down there all day. We just had a good time.
Young Josephine put it this way in her journal.
We didn't get civilized until we went to town.
There seemed to be a photographer and an opportunity for a picture at every growing moment in the girls' lives. Today, the Lotus Pond has nearly silted in. The main occupants are frogs and turtles. Also in the pond is an eastern newt. They are an aquatic salamander for most of their lives. They hatch from eggs laid by the adults in the pond. They remain in the pond for the first part of their lives. When they reach the juvenile stage, they shed their gills, leave the pond, and become completely terrestrial. It seems almost an act of rebellion. They become bright reddish-orange with red spots outlined in black. After spending 2 years as a terrestrial salamander, they return to the water for the rest of their life. They can live as long as 15 or 16 years. It would be hard to overstate H.P. Imes' passion for birds. He was active early in the history of the East Tennessee Audubon Society and helped found the East Tennessee Ornithological Society in 1924.
When he did a bird count here, they saw over 150 bird species, which is phenomenal. We typically get, I think our highest was around 70. He was really an advocate for preservation of habitat, which 100 years ago, that was kind of a more progressive thing.
He had more than 100 bird boxes scattered around the 20 acres of property, and he kept meticulous records of the birds' use of them.
Keep in mind that pre-1920s, birds were something you shot. Either you shot them for food if it was big enough, or you just shot them for target practice. Everyone did that. And it was largely because of the work of the Audubon Society, which H.P. picked up on and carried further, that bird life was to be protected and to be marveled at. Not only were the grounds protected, but what lived on the grounds were protected too.
H.P. was profoundly moved by the extinction of the passenger pigeon. The last one had died in a Cincinnati zoo in 1914. Passenger pigeons were once so numerous they blotted out the sun for days when they migrated. They were slaughtered by the billions until finally there were no more. HP once bought an enormous glass-enclosed collection of mounted birds just to get a mounted passenger pigeon. It was his most prized possession. He patented a nesting box that he sold for 20 years. He donated land for a clubhouse for the Ornithological Society. Even his work as a commercial artist found a way to use birds in unlikely places. HP's work as an artist created one of the more endearing moments of the tight-knit family. As he grew older, he turned 50 in 1926. It was obvious his appreciation for his unique daughters was a matter close to his heart. Every year he would create the Iams family Christmas card. The images were often quaint images of the family, right down to the dog. Over the years, Harry came upon a technique to make this Christmas card production a family affair. Mary Gallant is the daughter of Martha Iams.
How they colorized the cards I thought was really interesting. All the girls would be in line at the dining room table, and each one was in charge of a color, red, green, blue. So they had one designated, and then they just had an assembly line that Mother did red, Izzy would do green. One of my favorites is the Depression Christmas card with Santa, who's real skinny and has nothing in his bag, and here's the reindeer that's skin and bones. And he did it on a paper sack. And the caption was, "Merry Christmas anyhow." And so that captured everything.
When a place on the river returns, the Iams family's idyllic way of life is dealt a blow none could have imagined. The Great Depression of the 30s did not seem to change the pace at the Iams home. Alice, in a venture very unusual for a woman at the time, had started a greenhouse business on her own in the 1920s. The business thrived with her guidance and knowledge. The girls were active in school and swimming. Josephine was the athlete of the family, but Mary was not far behind. It was Mary's personality that caught everyone's attention.
She was popular with the boys and the girls. She was very pretty. She had dark curly hair, and she was always in a happy mood.
Yeah, she was always happy. She'd go swimming or get out and just dry her hair off with a towel and look better than she did before she went in. We were very envious of her curly hair.
Izzy was now in her early 20s and working for the Girl Scouts. She now owned a car, which makes an appearance on the 1930 Christmas card. One August morning in 1932, Izzy and Mary planned to go to North Carolina to pick up Josephine.
Can we bring you back anything from town?
Just bring me a mystery novel and a kipper.
Bye, Dad.
They said their customary goodbyes and were off in Izzy's new car. Mary, 16 at the time, was at the wheel.
How far is it to Banner Elk anyway? I don't know, maybe 100 miles or so, but the drive's pretty.
Mr. Iams, I'm sorry to inform you there's been an accident.
It seemed unbelievable. Mary was dead. In attempting to pass another car on Rutledge Pike, she had lost control.
I remember my mother saying that she heard a primal scream howl from my grandmother, something that she had never heard before or since when she found out.
The car had rolled at least 3 times. Both Mary and Izzy were thrown from the wreck. Izzy had survived. The Imes family had such a well-known reputation in Knoxville that Mary's death was front-page news. The week prior, she had been in the paper for winning swimming medals. The same photo ran with the car accident story.
It really shocked our whole town. It was devastating.
They never talked about it very much, but she was, I guess, the most outgoing of the 4 girls, and she was really left a hole in the family.
The great sadness and tragedy, not only in any life passing away when you're 16, but the obituaries in the local papers, really spoke to that people loved Mary. She was beloved by people.
The loss was felt by all the sisters, including the baby, Martha.
There was a song called Going Home that was played at her funeral, and I can remember she didn't talk about it a lot, but when she heard that, I don't think she ever got over it. It changed her, that whole thing.
Death is a part of the natural world, but even the naturalist H.P. Imes could not easily come to grips with the loss of his beloved Mary.
She may have been H.P.'s favorite, I don't know that for sure, but he was devastated. I think it took him a long time to recover from her death. A lot of his energy was taken away from the rest of the family. I think they were hurt by the degree that he pulled away from them.
Izzy moved away from Knoxville shortly after the accident. She took a job with the Girl Scouts in Winston-Salem, then Nashville, and ultimately in New York City. She would never live in the Island Home Sanctuary. However, she did visit at least once a year. It was likely Alice who rallied the family. She was a strong personality and had a straightforward approach to life. Work harder. Josephine was nearing adulthood. Martha certainly still needed parenting. The greenhouses needed attention in the gardens. The reality was life had to go on. It was the natural way. As a memorial to Mary, the Imes donated 2.5 acres of their sanctuary to the Girl Scouts. The property was made into a day camp, and the Girl Scouts named it Camp Mary Imes in 1939. It operated until the 70s. We gained some insight into the intensity of Alice's feelings toward Mary and the Girl Scouts in a letter she wrote to a Girl Scout council member.
While I am writing, I wish I could say a few of the things that have been in my heart these past few months, but which I have found impossible to put into words. What you cannot possibly know is how deeply touched and how greatly we appreciate the tribute to our Mary in giving the day camp her name. We love to see the girls come trooping in. We love the sound of their voices, their songs and happy laughter. In a way, they revitalize the memory of the one who has gone. Elizabeth and Joe are full-fledged adults now, and even Martha, our baby, on her birthday will have reached her majority. But Mary, precious little Girl Scout, is and will forever be young. Please convey this belated acknowledgement to the members of the council. Gratefully and affectionately, Alice Yo Imes.
Ruth DeFries first met Alice Imes in 1938 when she was leading a Girl Scout troop onto the Imes property. Today, at 99, Alice Imes remains one of her most unforgettable characters.
When my husband asked me that night, "How did you get along with the Girl Scouts today?" I said, "Oh, that was fine." But the most fascinating thing was Miss Imes. I found my father again. They were twins in. I can remember he would lift up soil and say, "Now, Ruthie, always leave it better than you found it." And Miss Imes was already into that business.
Both Ruth DeFries and Alice Imes were participants in the developing cultural changes of the time. For the first time, women were being accepted in positions outside the home. Alice had run her own greenhouse business since the 1920s. Ruth organized local women into 4-H and other self-help community groups. Even as they progressed in those roles, they were keenly aware of the price paid in all the modernization and development.
We went through a time when we forgot we were industrialized, so that we yearned for something that was bigger than life, and that's conservation, preservation. We were losing so much of it, and they were not caring for it like our ancestors did.
Alice Imes was instrumental in the formation of garden clubs throughout the Knoxville area, including the Chapman Highway Club Ruth DeFries belonged to. But at the time, they represented a way for women to have some influence in the public arena. Their beautification projects were an important part of Knoxville. One look at Alice Imes walking down the street, and you could tell this was a woman with a mission. As the 1940s came to a close, Alice and H.P. were alone in their rustic house, the girls out on their own. Martha was married in 1943 on the lawn of the Imes home. Her husband, Frank Lovingood, developed a close and caring relationship with H.P. Alice and H.P. were not alone out on the property. Between the birders, the garden clubbers, and the Girl Scouts, they were rarely without visitors. H.P. was now in his 70s. Stephen Lynn Bales of the Imes Nature Center is also an artist. He thinks he knows how many of these latter days were spent.
To be a naturalist, you basically are lost in the moment. You get outside in nature, and you're in the here and now. The past doesn't exist, the future doesn't exist, agendas, schedules don't exist. So whenever you do that, whenever you get lost in nature, you usually see something amazing. So I like to think that H.P. used to roam these same grounds and kind of get lost in the moment and carry his sketch pad with him and start sketching or drawing something he's seen.
H.P. took in orphan birds of all types with the hopes of returning them to the wild. His attempt to raise and release baby flying squirrels was a memorable moment for a young Jim Campbell.
I don't know what happened to the parents, but they were just about grown, and he gave me two of them. Their names were Mebo and Jibo, and we had a big hardware cloth enclosure about 5 feet tall and about 2.5 feet in diameter, and had a little limb in there. And of course they're nocturnal, and they would just fly around, not fly, but just crawl around that all the time. But I'm sure that the agreement was that they would soon be released, which they were.
In case you happen to think that ornithologists are a sober group, here's a story of one of their lighter moments. It involves a barn owl nest high in a tree. The rest you figure out on your own.
And he said, now the best way to see it, it's pretty high up in the tree. Stretch out on the ground and get your binoculars, and I'll scare the barn owl and make it fly off the nest. Well, what happened is they did that, and he had learned that they always whitewash. You know, when the birds take off, they lighten their load, as I call it. So they would be lying there, and this barn owl would take off, and they'd get splattered sometimes in the face.
One day, H.P. found he had some time on his hands. The bird side of the sanctuary was in great shape. Perhaps Alice needed some help on the horticultural side.
Oh, I remember my grandmother just being totally furious he planted that bamboo. It's still there. She just, it was like a weed. What the heck did you do that for? And once it's there, it's impossible. It's like a big form of crabgrass it was to her. She was the gardener. how dare he plant bamboo? Wasn't even his, his area. Just remember her being really perturbed about that.
H.P.'s last months were confined mostly to a chair, as he was contemplating what might happen upon his passing. Something important came to mind: his mounted passenger pigeon.
Dear Frank, in writing yesterday, I failed to mention the passenger pigeon. I've told you several times that if anything happened to me, I wanted you to have the bird. Alice also knows my wishes in this matter. Your greatest hazard is fire, so place it near a door and instruct everyone that it is to be the first thing to be saved, as it could never be replaced. Sincerely, H.P.
Frank complied with his wishes.
As a matter of fact, the house my father built in Blount County, you walked in the door and there was a special recess in a back of a stone fireplace with a light that was put there just for that passenger pigeon. And so it was right by the door.
In 1954, the years of smoking finally took its toll on Knoxville's first ornithologist. He died at age 77. By the time of H.P.'s death, Alice was beginning to show symptoms of dementia. She died in 1964. None of the Imes daughters are alive today. Their children remember they were forever marked by their time growing up at the sanctuary. Martha and George Kern, Josephine's children, actually spent the first years of their life in the Imes home. Joe preferred to live on those 20 acres as opposed to the 900-acre farm her husband's family owned.
When we were there, it still had very much the H.P. and Alice feel to it.
She returned to the sleeping porch of her childhood. No matter what the weather was, she found it the best place to sleep.
And my parents had the sleeping porch. My mom slept outside all her life. I mean, she couldn't sleep without the windows open. We had those, like everybody did around here, the aluminum tumblers, and that all of them had round bottoms because their bedside water froze solid all the time out there on the sleeping porch. They had an electric blanket in the, that was probably a great addition because my dad wasn't as keen on sleeping outside, I don't think, as my mom was. But I mean, it just seemed, it was what was natural to her.
Living outside for the first 20 years of your life creates a different set of sensibilities. Unrestrained might be the best way to describe them, and Josephine.
She was quite loud and she was quite the yodeler. And so I do remember that, like, she liked to yodel when we were stuck in traffic. And you would just wish that you could just disappear, which now I wish I could be in the car with her yodeling.
The youngest daughter, Martha, was a beloved schoolteacher in Blount County where she lived. In the end, Martha also developed dementia. According to her daughter Mary, as her memories became confused, one memory remained consistent.
One of the things she would always remember was her time here. As a matter of fact, she used to think that everyone was still here, and she wanted to go home to Mother. So that, to me, just shows the deep love she had for this place.
As far as anyone knows, H.P. and Alice made no plans for the sanctuary after their death. But their friends, the people they had influenced, believed the place should be preserved. After funds were privately raised to buy it, the city took receipt of the Imes property. It was dedicated as a city park in 1968. Imes Nature Center is the end result of that process. In the intervening years, much of the personal story of H.P. and Alice Imes faded from the community's memory. With the publication of Paul James's book, the hope is the unique story of the Imes family will find a permanent place in Knoxville's collective memory. Today, their original property, H.P.'s ponds and Alice's plantings, still exist, but their rustic house is gone. The Nature Center that contains the property has grown into 275 acres of remarkably varied landscape. When we return, the sound of curious children once again echoes from the woods and waters at the place by the river. The Imes Nature Park, as the property was then called, developed over the years. At first, volunteers led nature walks. Gradually, it became obvious that a more ambitious plan for the property was necessary. After becoming a nonprofit organization, full-time directors and a staff were gradually added to what is now known as Imes Nature Center. When H.P. and Alice bought their secluded sanctuary in 1910, the fear was such that land such as this would soon disappear. Today, the fear is that in the future, those who care about such places as this are the ones disappearing.
What we've noticed is that with kids, they're really starting to see nature as something that only exists outside their window or outside their house. They don't really recognize their role as part of the ecosystem. We're raising a population of kids that haven't caught tadpoles and haven't tried to get the honey out of honeysuckles and haven't caught lightning bugs in jars. Because in a few years, they're going to be the decision makers, and if they don't feel that connection with nature, they may not be as dedicated to preserving the natural areas and the parks that we have now.
One of the important missions of the Imes Nature Center is to educate.
Things come in full circles, and this great green movement that's going on right now really sits well with what Imes does. But of course, we've been doing it for decades. And whether it's a fad or comes in and out of style, Imes Nature Center, I hope will continue to embrace that and maintain that passion and the mission of Imes.
Martha and George Kern, Josephine's children, were the last children to live on the property. In the 1960s, it remained secluded, a wild landscape and fertile ground for a curious child.
I remember the day that they told us that we were moving. It happened to be one of those days that we were going to go walk over there and go to the cave, and they broke it to us before we went. And I remember we both cried about it. It was very sad.
For today's children, such an existence is rare and more typically one to be ignored.
I think there's a big movement now to keep kids from staying inside and to get kids to go outside more. And I think that the schools are trying to do a better job too. And I think if parents can just get more on board with that, I'm not fearful. I'm just hopeful that more people will want their kids to be outside and want their kids to be part of nature and not
Okay, try that one.
disconnected from it.
It smell like apple a little bit? A little bit, right?
The addition of land that contained abandoned quarries is now part of the Nature Center holdings. The addition of the quarry property stands as testament to the power of nature. When H.P. and Alice lived on the land, the quarries were in operation, complete with the noise and dust. Today, the gradual and unrelenting power of plant life is slowly reclaiming the landscape. The beauty of Imes is how quickly it sheds one's sense of being in a city. There are so many different views, it is difficult to relate it to any one place. There are pieces of riverbank, linked to decaying forest floors, marshy lowland that leads to walls of solid rock. Some of it looks and sounds comfortably familiar, and other parts are completely foreign. On the original 20 acres, the plantings of Alice Imes mesh with the landscape. Everywhere, descendants of H.P.'s bird population define their territory. There are different caretakers now, of course. It is public land. Many who visit here do not make the connection between the land and the family. It is not a requirement. But to know the story of the family is to add a layer of texture beyond the visual. To understand that the human spirit finds refuge in such places, and that such a relationship should be preserved and celebrated. I'm Bill Landry, and this is the Heartland Series. You can read more about the Imes family and the nature center they inspired. The book, Imes Nature Center by Paul James, is available at the center's gift shop and area booksellers.